Welcome to our Bible study in Romans. We are on chapter 11, verses 7 through 15. And again, as always, if you've not watched up to this, stick around, but you probably need to go back and catch up after this because you might get a little lost. This is all supposed to be one big part of a big thought, right? And so we're looking at the third section of Romans where Paul is talking how Israel now fits into the situation. And so we've looked at in this section so far as the story so far, how God has worked through Israel, how it's gotten to the point where they've rejected Jesus as the Messiah for the most part, and how God has, through their failures, allowed the Gentiles to become part of his family. That people not looking for it found it, and those who were looking for it missed it. And so that got us to the point where last week we started looking at the question, was God done with Israel? Right? If he's welcomed in the Gentiles, and that was the plan all along, is he done with them? And so last week we looked at step one where we talked about a remnant, right? Like the remnant being the last thing, sometimes as a kid there was always the remnant of milk left or the remnant of the cereal left, like the remnant of the last piece of cake, the little bit that survived towards the end that nobody wanted to throw away or eat because then you'd have to, throw away the jug or whatever, right? Like Israel has had a remnant. This is a very biblical concept, and God has promised there would always be a remnant no matter what Israel faced. No matter how unfaithful they would be, there would always be a remnant left behind. We see all that through the exile. We saw that through all the invasions and all of that behind, and through Elijah's story, through all the moments where Israel looked like they were done, there was always a remnant left behind. But Paul says now there is a remnant in Israel who is a remnant of grace, who are staying faithful despite all their brothers and sisters turning away. And it's important. He says at the end of last week's section, in the same way, at the present time, there is a remnant chosen by grace. But if it is by grace, it is no longer by works. Otherwise, grace would no longer be grace. So what Paul is saying is that in contrast to all the previous remnants of Israel who were working or keeping the law well enough to be a remnant, this one, it's not about works. It's entirely about grace. Those who have faith in Christ. That's the only remnant that is truly part of the family of God within Israel. And again, it's important that you remember that the context of everything we're talking about today is about Israel and them being faithful to Jesus or not. Them being part of the family of God now. Despite the fact that they've turned their back as a whole on God, on Christ. Paul is discussing how God has a stance towards them, how he stands towards them. So we're looking at answering that question, is God done with Israel? And if so, if not, then how is he working to save them? And so in verse 7 of chapter 11, we find this. It says, "What then? Did Israel not obtain what it was looking for? Well, the chosen ones obtained it, but the rest were hardened. As the Bible says, God gave them a spirit of stupor, eyes that wouldn't see, and ears that wouldn't hear, right down to this present day. As David says, let their table become a snare and a trap, and a stumbling block and a punishment for them. Let their eyes be darkened so they can't see, and make their backs bend low forever." So I ask then, have they tripped up in such a way as to fall completely? Certainly not. Rather, by their trespass, salvation has come to the nations in order to make them jealous. If their trespass means riches for the world and their impoverishment means riches for the nations, how much more will their fullness mean? Now I am speaking to you Gentiles insofar as I am the apostle of the Gentiles. I celebrate my particular ministry so that if possible, I can make my flesh jealous and save some of them. If their casting away, you see, means reconciliation for the world, what will their acceptance mean but life from the dead? See, if you study the Bible and you look at family, you look at the concept of family, there's a lot of really, really exposing ideas in there that really give us a clue into what God has been doing. If you look at the study of Big Brother versus Little Brother, you come away with some of the best and most popular stories in the Bible, but it leaves you with kind of a head scratcher. Right? If you look at the story of the prodigal son, right? You have Jesus telling a story where the younger brother says, "Dad, I wish you were dead. Give me my inheritance." And he takes off and ruins his life, comes back begging. He says, "Father, I'll be a servant." And Dad cuts him off, says, "No, you're my son. Welcome back." All he had to do was humble himself. And they throw a party, and the older brother is jealous that, despite the fact that he was faithful and he did what he was supposed to do the whole time, the younger brother's the one getting the party. That's from Luke 15. If you look at the story of Cain and Abel in Genesis 4, God accepts Abel's sacrifice, but not Cain's. And then so Cain gets mad and kills his brother. And then he's doomed to walk through the world the rest of his life as a marked man. constantly bearing the sins that he's committed and murdering his brother. You look at the story of Ishmael and Isaac in Genesis 21. Ishmael is the older brother. He was born to Hagar, but yet Isaac is preferred over him. If you look at the story of Esau and Jacob from Genesis 27, the older brother Esau is submitted below Jacob. The younger brother is established over the older one. Joseph and his brothers, the coat of many colors, that despite the fact that they sold him into slavery after thinking about killing him, that in the end he is established as superior to his older brothers. And if you go through and you look at each one of these stories and how they end, it gets us even closer to what God is doing. We see that the prodigal, at the end, the older brother's mad, but there's no reconciliation there. Cain, he murdered Abel, so there's definitely no reconciliation there. Ishmael, him and Isaac part ways and basically never see each other again. Esau and Jacob, kind of the same thing. They do kind of run into each other at one point, but they still kind of live, arm's reach away. Joseph, he pranked his family super hard and was like, hey, by the way, I'm your little brother. And we'll talk about him more in a minute, but that's the only one where it's like they reconciled. Then in the end, the older brother and the younger brother, they part ways. See, Romans chapter 10 ends with a big old road sign that kind of points that this is the situation with Israel and the Gentiles. Again, it says those who weren't looking for God found him through Jesus, and those who were looking for him missed him, being Israel and the Gentiles. God stands towards Israel as his arms open. That's how that chapter ends. But Paul is setting it up so that we see Israel as the older brother, which I think is what Jesus also wanted his audience to see as well. They've been part of God's family far longer than the Gentile little brother who just has been welcomed in through Jesus. The prodigal son, the Gentile son in this analogy, the reconcile between him and his father, it causes jealousy in the older brother. And I want you to pay attention too to how the little brother got to become part of the family again. He wanted to be a servant or slave. He wanted to work. Maybe that'd be good enough. Kind of second class, right? He's not on equal footing with the other brother. But the dad just says, no, you just humble yourself and I am welcoming you back. It's all about what the fathers did, as we said earlier. And that's Paul's point in a sense here. That there's only one way to reconcile with God, and that is through faith. It's not about works. It's not about a servant class and a family class, a son class. It's simply humble yourself and be welcomed. And that's really, 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 really important, because if you listen to some people, they get this really, really wrong. A lot of people will say that somehow at some point Israel's going to get a pass, that they're going to get to bypass Jesus and be welcomed into the family of God simply because of who they are. And if you've paid attention to our study of Romans, you know that's categorically not true. There's no way. It is 100% through Jesus, faith in Jesus alone. Paul does not teach that Israel will get to bypass Jesus at all. It is faith in Jesus alone. And so that gets us back to our question of, well, all right, if the step one of answering our question is God done with Israel, is he's leaving a remnant? No, then what's step two? Paul starts by referencing Deuteronomy 29:4, which again, this is Moses' words. If you are a faithful Israelite, you know these words. You've memorized them probably. He says in 29 verse 4, but to this day the Lord has not given you a heart to understand, or eyes to see, or ears to hear. And this is an interesting thought that really kind of should make you go, what? Because essentially this is Paul pointing to Moses saying the plan all along was for some of Israel to be blind and deaf to what God is doing. And it's like, okay, and it's like, it takes you to the next step of okay, they've missed what God is doing, what God's plan was all along, and somehow it's God's fault that they missed it. Why? And for what reason? And then he quotes David in Psalm 69. He says, let the bountiful table set before them become a snare, and their prosperity become a trap. Let their eyes go blind so they cannot see, and make their bodies shake continually, meaning they have to work continually. Let them be slaves, essentially. David is when he wrote these words, he's basically looking at the rebellious Israelites who are not being faithful, and he's saying, let even the good things in their life, the things that are meant to unite us together, let even them be a trap so that they miss what God is doing. The family meal is supposed to unite, but the table fellowship, let it even be a trap for them. And again, it's kind of and it's God's fault that they miss it. And so we continue to ask, Why? Why would God do this, and for what reason? So let's look back at 11 and 12 of Romans chapter 11 again. It says, "So I ask then, has Israel tripped up in a way as to fall completely? Certainly not. Rather, by their trespass, salvation has come to the nations in order to make them being Israel, jealous. If their trespass means riches for the world and their impoverishment means riches for the nations, how much more will their fullness mean?" See, there's some concepts that Paul has introduced throughout this study about what God has kind of done towards Israel and what emotions it was supposed to inspire in them. Jealousy and stumbling. See, Israel has tripped over the stone that was laid in their path. That's a pretty famous kind of idea within Scripture, that the cornerstone that was laid is the one that the builder rejected, and it's become a stumbling block to those who think it's just a worthless rock in the road. If you look at verses 11 and 12, you'll notice this word trespass. And, you see that in the very beginning of verse 11, it talks about stumbling, of tripping, but then it uses that word trespass, and we might miss that in English because it's the Greek word paraptoma. Like that's what it comes from. It's various versions of it or forms of it. And that word means a side slip, a lapse or deviation, an unintentional error, or a willful transgression. And so by using this word, Paul is basically saying that they're going to stumble, but it's not going to be an accident, right? It's implying that they're not just making a mistake, but intentionally stepping into the wrong place, intentionally sidestepping and losing their footing as a result, falling down as a result of that paraptoma, that sidestep. But what Paul is implying here, and this is the thing that we need to really focus in on, is that all of that was necessary. All of that blindness, that deafness to what God was doing amongst Israel was for a reason. It wasn't just because God was cruel. It was part of the plan. See, if you look at the end of Joseph's story, there's this moment of like unimaginable grace and forgiveness that he shows his family. Like imagine like they sold you into slavery. Yeah, it turned out, but it's like that's got to hurt. But he says in chapter 50, verse 20, Joseph looks at his family and says, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it all for good. He brought me to this position so I could save the lives of many people." See, Joseph, he reconciles because he recognizes that what his family did to him for evil, well, God used for good. Paul says that Israel's evil, their stumbling, was for the good of the nations, for the good of the many. And if we objectively take a step back and we think about, well, what would have happened if Israel had as a whole accepted Jesus as the Messiah? What would that have looked like to the rest of the world? If Israel as a nation was like, yep, Jesus is our Messiah, and we are, that's it, that's us, we're good, right? We're all saved. The rest of the world, at best, if they decided to accept Jesus, would have been second-class citizens, because it would have looked like God was just acting on behalf of his people still. And that was the worldview back then, that every nation, every people had their own set of gods, and if that people was dominant, it was because their gods were dominant. And so if Israel's Messiah, Jesus, came and they all accepted it, it would have just looked like that henotheistic, that worldview, that their God was acting on their behalf. This would have left the Gentiles as second class, and we've established at length in this study that's never been the plan. The plan all along has been to welcome them in as full citizens of the kingdom, as equal with Israel. There's no second class anything. The ground before the cross is level. And because of this, because Gentiles have been welcomed in and they have equal footing with their Israelite brothers who have accepted Jesus, it has the effect of causing jealousy in those who are sitting outside. It's back to the prodigal son story, that you have the older brother sitting outside listening to the party, jealous, throwing his hissy fit. What Paul says here is his mission is to the Gentiles, but it's in part to inspire jealousy so that the Israelites who see the party, who see these Gentiles having the full benefits of being part of the family of God now, that they will become jealous and join the party. Reread Romans chapter 10, verses 14 through 19 again. That's what he says explicitly. That's why he quotes what he quotes. And then you read verses 13 and 14 of today's section again. And Paul is explicit. His job is to the Gentiles, but he's hoping to make the Israelites jealous so that they will come and join the party. He's trying to save Israelites by saving Gentiles. That's his mission. That's his task. And all of this culminates In the last verse of today's section, chapter 11, verse 15, it says, if they're casting away, if Israelites casting away, you see, it means reconciling for the world. What will their acceptance mean but life from the dead? If Israel turning their back on Jesus means the world finds him, what would it mean for their acceptance of him? And this is where we get to see something kind of gives you chills. The Israel story is the Messiah story. N.T. Wright, in his commentary, Paul for Everyone, he says, what Paul is asking us to imagine is that what has happened to ethnic Israel and the purposes of God is nothing short of an acting out of what happened to the Messiah. He was brought low so that the world might be lifted up. He was cast away for the reconciliation of the world and brought back to life so that all might live through him. God has, as it were, written the story of the Messiah into the larger history as the story of the Messiah's people according to the flesh. The only way Paul knows how to understand what has happened to Israel is the pattern of Jesus the Messiah, the one in whom all God's secret wisdom is now revealed. That's a big clue as to where we're going at the end of this chapter. If you have any questions, reach out. Otherwise, we'll see you next time.